In Rise of Kingdoms, sometimes when you don't have field control and you need to take control of a situation or just do some damage to your enemies, the best way to do this can be through city popping or cheeseburgering. And in today's video, I'm going to be updating my top 10 city popping / cheeseburgering marches as of 2024. The last guide was just when Lao Che released, and we've seen a ton of development in the commanders that people run. So if you're interested in really the best city popping marches, and I'm sure you can probably run a few of them on this list, you want to stick around till the end of the video. Now, let's start off with the first rank on our list, or rank number 10. This is probably the weakest of all 10 city marches I will talk about today, but it's the one that really inspired me to make today's video, and that is Henry Cyrus. I've actually been getting a lot of success out of running Henry Cyrus as a city pop march, and I think it's a very viable archer march, similar to Pakal and Harold, similar to Attila Takeda, except with revenge skill damage. The reason this march works so well is you don't really care that much about your active skill. I mean, yes, it's nice to get the active skill on Henry, but really what you're trying to do is get hit and then quickly run back into a city, because Henry has a revenge damage here, and then Cyrus also has a revenge AoE, and has additional damage he can deal to a target that's just instant damage. So this march is really good at just popping out of a city, dealing a ton of instant damage and retreating. Sometimes you can get a report of like 600,000 kill points to like 200,000, but the reason this march isn't really higher on the list, because you think, well, this thing is immortal, I mean, it's never going to get a bad trade, is because it is based on luck. A lot of these things have chances to trigger, and unless you get really lucky, it isn't really guaranteed. Obviously, though, if you do get lucky with this march, your trade's going to be ridiculous, and even if you get like 15x swarmed, you're still going to trade pretty positive for the 5-10 turns that you're out there. So that's the one thing I've really noticed with Henry Cyrus. It's a lot more luck-based, but that being said, there's decent march speed on it, so you can get back to the city quicker, and there's just a lot of revenge damage that's on that march. So I think this march is definitely one of the more niche kind of open field city popping marches, but it definitely has its place, and if you're running it, I mean, it's definitely going to be pretty nice. That being said though, obviously it can't really deal crazy high skill damage, so unless you're in a situation where you're just being swarmed out crazy quickly, and none of your other marches that I'll talk about later, ones with Zulang especially, can deal the same damage, then you might want to bring out a tankier march like a Henry or a Cyrus if you have those commanders. Coming in at number 9 on today's list, and this march is very similar to that of a Henry and a Cyrus, is Pakal and Harold. This march is once again just a fairly high instant damage march from the Harold, and then just pretty good counterattack from Pakal. This march is just only going to be used if you can't use any of your other city popping marches. Obviously, Pakal and Harold used to be the king of cheeseburgering, but nowadays, I think with the newer and definitely much stronger archer commanders available to a lot of players, these commanders don't hold up as well, and if you are a whale, they can be a little bit better, but for most lower spender free-to players who A, just don't have access to them, and B, don't really have the technology and also the equipment to run them, the Pakal and Harold march just isn't going to be too good, and you don't even see him very much on the open field today. But that being said, he can still definitely do a number on your opponents, and if you are, for some reason, getting swarmed down a lot and your Henry Cyrus isn't working, this march is probably going to be a tad bit better. Coming in at number 8 on today's list, and this march is slightly better than Pakal and Harold, and I would say quite a bit better than Henry Cyrus, is the Attila and Takeda, and we all know this march is a tried and true city popping combination, because literally all you're doing is normal damage. You just pop out of your city, you get swarmed, and you're usually going to get like a 1-for-1 or 2-for-1 trade, depending on how good your technology is. We know that Attila, really everything in his kit is about increasing his attack, increasing his counterattack. He has nothing in his kit that is even remotely related to skill damage besides taking less skill damage. So you'll notice, really, it's really strong to have this as a city popping march, since anyone that swarms it, especially if there's a lot of lower power players nearby, you'll notice that the march is just going to trade pretty damn good. So Attila Takeda, even though once again it's not the most meta nowadays, is still pretty nice. Another thing we also really like about this march is the fact that, I mean, it's got some pretty good march speed, especially if you can trigger this bonus here on Takeda, and I mean, that's just a good thing to have over the infantry and the archers, who are a tad bit slower, and every second actually does make a difference in a city pop. 1 second can take you from like 300,000 units down to like 200,000 if you get hit by an active skill. So having good march speed on a city popping march is really nice, and I think Attila and Takeda are a very good balance between counterattack and damage, and then the march speed that cavalry just have that improve their trades. Coming in at number 6 today, we have Nevsky and Joan. I mean, this march is tried and true for the open field. A lot of people still run it, and it did rank higher on my previous city popping list. But honestly, I think it's not as strong as it used to be nowadays, purely just because Nevsky is struggling a lot against the newer infantry like Lao Che and Gorgo, and when you see them on the open field, their normal damage can definitely hurt you. Not to mention, with the rise of Alex Lao Che as well, you'll notice that Nevsky just isn't as good with city popping, especially if you do hit a Lao Che and an Alex and it gets instant damage on you, or if you do get hit by one. So I think Nevsky Joan is still good, don't get me wrong. If it's your open field march, you can certainly still city pop with it. And there are definitely some good things about the march. If you can get Joan's full skill cycle to trigger, you're going to get amazing trades. Obviously, though, sometimes that's not very possible. And with some of the other marches I mentioned, like Attila Takeda and Pakal and Harold, and even Henry and all that, their active skills aren't as important. They are good, but they're not necessary. And the same thing for the other marches that come up. Once again, their active skills are going to be very good, and not 100% necessary. And with Nevsky Joan, their active skill takes around, like, I think 4 or 5 full turns before everything triggers, which means you can somewhat struggle to get all that out in one city pop. And because one of Joan's strongest things is the double active skill, it definitely does screw her over a little bit in the long run. And the same thing with Nevsky, because he definitely wants her to deal the crazy high skill damage. So I think there is a little bit of not really a de-synergy with city popping, but just a little bit of a struggle there between the commanders. But that being said, if you get a good city pop, you're just going to get a good trade with these commanders. Nevsky is definitely very fast. He's got a fairly good rage engine. He's boosting skill damage by a lot. And Joan is just a really punchy commander who's going to deal crazy damage if you get her full skill cycle to trigger. So that's really the only issue I have with the march. It's a bit weak in the current meta. And also Joan's active skills sometimes can't fully trigger. But I think once we see newer Cav commanders, we will probably see a bit more of a resurgence in the basically rankings of city popping commanders. But this is the last Cav march that is really on today's list. One thing I would also give an honorable mention to is Zhang Yu with Nevsky, just because, I mean, I think it's fairly similar. I think Joan's still a tad bit better, but Zhang Yu with Nevsky, the thing is, because he's got a really fast rage cycle, if you really need to get active skills off and you want to just deal the quick active skill damage, Zhang Yu can pretty much outspeed any commander in the game in terms of gaining rage. So I think it's quite easy to use a Zhang Yu with a Nevsky if you really need fast rage. Same thing with Zhang Yu and Joan, but I don't think it's really good to put them on the list since Zhang Yu isn't the most overpowered, though he has his uses, and he can also be very glass cannon, so there's kind of a disadvantage there if you are running him, but he can also be really good. So if you have a Zhang Yu and you want to run him with a Joan or a Nevsky just to deal quick burst skill damage and run away, it can also really work, but if you do get hit by a lot of marches, it might even get sad faced. That's just because how squishy Zhang Yu can be, so do keep that in mind. But I think Zhang Yu with Nevsky and Joan is also pretty decent if you need a faster rage cycle that's going to get all the skills off pretty quickly. I mean, even Zhang Yu with Joan, you could probably get both Joan's active skill and double active skill off before your opponents will actually hit you unless you're fighting like a Hao Che Bing. Coming in at number 5 today, we have a march that I actually ranked lower on my previous list that I think is worthy of going up now. He's a Scipio with an Alexander the Great. I mean, I think at the time when I made the video, Alexander the Great did not have his museum relic. That's just definitely a nice thing to have nowadays. And Alexander the Great is probably one of the most annoying city popping commanders because the way you use him to just make your opponents want to quit the game is you just literally keep popping in and out of your city. You hit the opponents for around 2 to 3 turns and you run away. Do it again. Repeat that. You keep repeating that because Alexander's active skill is completely useless. Like quite literally it does nothing for you. But his second skill, his passive skill, is literally an active skill but with a chance to trigger. So you can keep popping in and out of a city until the sun comes home and you'll just be dealing this instant damage factor. That's ridiculously high, mind you. I mean, it's 1,700 instant damage factor into your opponents. It's going to give him like 5,000 wounds of T4, maybe like 1,000 to 2,000 of T5. And it's really going to do a number on them. The reason Scipio goes with the Alexander the Great here is just because, I mean, Scipio also has instant damage. I think it is this skill right here. And not to mention, if you run Scipio as the primary in this pairing, if you do get to stay out for a little bit longer, you're going to get an AoE onto your opponents as well. So that's definitely a very nice thing to have. And so I think Scipio Alex is worthy of rank 5 on this list and could maybe argue to go up a few tiers, could maybe be argued to go down a few tiers. But I think if you use it right and you pop in and out of your city constantly just to be an absolute menace, you're going to get crazy good amounts of trades. Obviously, this march is going to take longer to get a good trade. I mean, it's going to probably take 5-10 minutes before you really start to see a lot of kills. but it's just much more safe and it just deals crazy damage. You'll pretty much be guaranteed a good trade with a Scipio Alex if you do run it correctly. Coming in at number 4, and this is going to be an Archer March, and this is the Xuelang YSG. I mean, this March has always been very, very, very strong if your opponents don't have absolute field dominance. Like if I show you as an example right now, if us down here in BI34, if someone was city popping us with a Xuelang YSG right now, I mean, these marches would absolutely decimate it. But if you are in a situation where maybe there's only 5 or 6 people online, maybe about 30 marches, and you can city pop correctly, or maybe they're not paying full attention, you will literally decimate them in trades. You will get trades of like 300,000 kill points to 30,000 every single time. Obviously, the reason this happens is because their AoEs are just ridiculously strong, and with an Expertise Xuelang, you're going to get pretty much a double AoE like Joan, except it's on a passive skill, so it should trigger literally right after his active skill, which means it will trigger with YSG's active skill as well. So if you stay out on the open field for a little bit longer, you're pretty much guaranteed a very strong trade here. Obviously, also, YSG is just boosting skill damage immensely, which is amazing to have, and is also giving you really good range, not to mention has a lot of damage on his own. So this March is really, really glass cannon, and it can get killed off really quickly, but I had immense success using it in my previous KVK and a little bit in this KVK, and obviously when you're not being swarmed out too quickly, this March is probably one of, if not the best city popping marches in the game, but because of its inability to really survive very long and the fact that if you get hit it's usually a bad trade, it is only ranking at rank 4 today rather than like rank 1 or 2, which is where it could actually be in the situations that it really does excel, especially when you aren't being swarmed down. Now, coming in at number 4 on today's list, we have another Archer March, and it's another one with Xuelang, and this is a Xuelang with a Henry. This March is probably the best middle ground between the YSG Xuelang and also just having a good amount of tankiness, because we saw with our rank 10 March, Henry is a tanky commander. I mean, that's no doubt about that, and he's going to be able to deal some pretty good damage even if you do get swarmed. The good thing about this though is you have the Xuelang there, which is going to allow you to deal just extra damage factor, crazy amounts of damage, and you're going to be fairly tanky and somewhat anti-swarm from the Henry. If you're running Henry as the primary, I mean, if you want to go for a longer skill like cycle, you can do that. But really, for most players, you're going to run Xuelang with the Feral Nature tree just to get crazy quick rage cycles and really drop 2000 damage AoEs plus the secondary AoEs, and then sometimes even Henry's active skill as well into your opponents and just absolutely delete them. So Xuelang with Henry, really good city popping march if you're not really being swarmed too heavily but you are being swarmed a little bit. This march is probably one of the better marches in the game just to get the AoE damage and get some pretty good just normal damage and also counterattack out of your Henry. So I think this march is a very good middle ground for city popping, and not to mention if you're going outside of Alliance territory while you're doing it, maybe they're a little bit far from your city, then you're pretty much going to get some decent march speed out of the Henry as well, which will allow you to retreat pretty quickly or get to your opponents a little bit faster, which is always nice. So Henry with Xuelang, I think it's worthy of number 4 today. You could argue maybe Scipio Alex could be better, but I think number 6, 5, and 4 are really similar. They just have different use cases. Scipio Alex, you want to use him when you're being not really swarmed very much, but you can just really annoy your opponents by going in and out of your city. YSG Xuelang, you use it pretty much anytime you're not being swarmed. And then Henry Xuelang is the middle ground between probably both those commanders. I think Scipio Alex is more tanky, Xuelang YSG is super not tanky, and then Henry, pretty good damage and pretty good tank, kind of in between there. So Henry Xuelang, definitely a very solid march, and if you're using it as a city pop, you're going to get some good trades. I've seen our opponents use it this KVK, I've seen some of my allies use it this KVK, it's always going to get a pretty decent trade, and if you've got high crystal tech, I mean, you're just going to start decimating people with this march as a city pop, just because of how tanky your Henry can get and the amount of counterattack you can start to deal. So now as we move into the top 3 on today's list, let's start off with number 3, and this is yet again another Archer March, and this is another one with Xuelang. I mean, as you can see, Xuelang is a pretty good city popping commander just because of his damage, and it goes to Xuelang with Herman. I mean, who would have guessed putting 2 fairly decent double AoE commanders, the newest one in the game as well, onto a city popping march would do good. And I mean, it just does pretty damn good. Xuelang with Herman is going to trade pretty decent every single time. I think it's also kind of a little bit squishier than the Henry, but a little bit tankier than the YSG, just because of Hermann's basically defense boost and also his own march speed bonuses. Not to mention he can get an okay all damage reduction, maybe 2-3% if you do get that active skill to trigger, or you get the third skill to trigger. Obviously this march is pretty damn good just because the double AoE on their active skills, and then him being a fairly tanky commander, it really does bring him a little bit above the Henry in my opinion. Even though Henry's tankier, Hermann's AoE with a bit of march speed and a bit of tank kind of does make up for it. In this situation, you're going to run the Xuelang as the primary, and a lot of people have access to this march. It's another reason why I've put it a little bit higher, since a lot of people have Hermann 5551 or they're using him at expertise in their open field. I mean, Hermann would be pretty much fine with any player if they do have access to him, and a lot of people have Xuelang. So if you're running that march, you can use it to city pop, don't even have to change your equipment. You'd be perfectly fine and ready to go with it. So I think Hermann with Xuelang, definitely worthy of number 3 today, though it can once again be kind of outshunned by Xuelang YSG or Henry Xuelang or even CPO Alex in some situations depending on where you are, but I think it's overall a little bit more useful and a little bit more consistent than the other marches previously. Now coming in at number 2 on today's list, and this is a really strong march on the open field as well. This is the CPO with Lao Che, and it's really just because Lao Che is really overpowered for city popping. He has the extra normal attacks here, which is probably the biggest thing in his kit, because it's once again in like insane amounts of instant damage. It's just instant damage on like another level. Not only are you dealing extra normal attacks, you can deal extra instant damage. You increase your chance to really deal this stuff. So for example, even though this instant damage isn't very high, you pretty much take this 25% chance to like a 37.5%. And the same thing with CPO Africanus, even though this is only a 10% chance to trigger, because Lao Che can trigger double normal skills, he can trigger double CPO Africanus, which means there's double the chance, really. It's not double the chance, it's like 0.25 times the chance for CPO to trigger the instant damage here as well. Not to mention, they've both got AoE, which is an amazing thing. They're both going to deal crazy high AoE damage if you can get the skill cycle rolling. That's probably the only issue with this. There's not much rage gain on this march, though you can say I'm pretty sure Lao Che's double normal attacks here does increase your rage. It is kind of like having a feral nature, so you could get active skills off pretty consistently, but then again, you might not get them as well as other marches, and you may only be able to get your primary commander's active skill off. So I recommend probably running Lao Che as the primary here, even though the support tree is technically, I would say, better in a longer open field situation, because Lao Che is going to be just there for instant active skills. You want to just get as one active skill out as soon as possible. You would rather Lao Che as the primary, since he's going to deal the smite damage factor here, and he's also going to deal a 5 target AoE with just more damage than CPO. Plus, you can also reduce your opponent's march speed with a Lao Che, which means when you're city popping, if someone's trying to run away, you might be able to catch up and get maybe even a whole extra skill cycle on them, and stuff like this will definitely improve your trades greatly, like literally take them to the next level. Now the final and in my opinion best city popping march right now, and this one wasn't even on my top 10 in my previous city march video, is an Alexander the Great with a Lao Che. This march is absolutely insane with what you can do. You run Lao Che as the primary and you just go ballistic. You can stay outside of your city to throw off the best active skill in the game, or you can just pop in and out to do ridiculous amounts of damage with Alexander's kit. I mean, the basically possibilities here are absolutely endless, just because of how much extra damage and stuff you can deal. Not to mention, Alexander the Great doesn't really have any need for a skill damage boost, so he's perfectly fine as he is, and if you get his active skill to trigger, you're going to give yourself a pretty good shield, which means you can usually get away from any situation. Since what sometimes happens with city popping is you pop out, you get your active skill, the opponent gets an active skill on their march, and you get hit by a bit of skill damage, and if your march is a little bit weaker than your opponent's, it can actually completely ruin your trade. But Alexander the Great's shield right here will pretty much allow you to negate that effect and pretty much cancel your opponent's active skill. Not to mention, we know Lao Che extra normal attacks. Alexander the Great benefits from normal attacks, so you're going to trigger his his active skill. I call this his active skill, but it's not really, but you're going to trigger his active skill that much more often, just because he's going to deal this 1700 damage factor a little bit more often, which means when you pop out of your city, you're probably going to be guaranteed to get a Alex trigger within the first 5 or 6 turns, instead of the first 10 turns as it used to be before. So I think Lao Che with Alexander the Great, easily the best city popping march. There's so many ways you can run it. You can run it to get Lao Che's active skill. You can run it just to get Alexander the Great's damage proc. You can run it literally just as a quick speedy march to hit someone and run away with. you could use this March in pretty much any manner. So I think Lauche Alex easily takes the number 1 spot today. And if you do have this March, which a lot of players do, A, I'm jealous, and B, you're just going to get a fairly decent trade if you use it right. The very thing I like about this March is just how adaptable it is. I mean, the open field is constantly changing. Like 10 seconds ago, there were Marches all the way up here fighting, like literally right up here at the SJD fort, and now they're all the way down at the bottom and they're fighting at this flag. So the open field, it just changes rapidly. There's actually a flag building as we speak. So being able to pretty much have one March that does it all is always really nice, which is why I would say Lauche with Alex is definitely worthy of rank 1 in today's video, just because it works as somewhat tanky, somewhat fast, somewhat instant damage, somewhat high damage factor. You really just can't go wrong with it. So now, if you enjoyed today's video, I want to ask you guys for a very small favor, and that is, tell me in the comments, what are your favorite city popping Marches? I remember one of the reasons that I ended up looking into Lauche Alex was someone in my comments was like, I use Lauche Alex to city pop, and he's just crazy good. And I mean, I think I've seen that nowadays. I've seen the strength of a Lauche Alex. So if you guys want to tell me your favorite city popping Marches in the comments, do let me know. I read every comment, I respond to every comment, and I'm always quite interested to see what city popping Marches you guys are using, what open field Marches you're using. It always does interest me. Now, with that all out of the way, I just want to say thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.